a steadily increasing trend, about 1/3 of adults in the US have used dating apps. In general, these interactions are harmless and at times can yield beautiful lifelong relationships. However, these stories were submitted by 3 different women who unfortunately experienced the dangers behind modern-day dating culture. Viewer discretion is advised. I was 20 years old and I had never had a boyfriend. All my life I've been pretty shy and I grew up in a small town where dating options were limited, so I spent most of my time trying to find a boyfriend on dating sites online. I met a few nice people, but being paranoid about the whole meeting in real life thing prevented me from ever asking anyone out on a date. But then I met Mike. Mike seemed perfect. He was my age, we shared the same interests, we had the same sense of humor. Our conversations quickly moved from OkCupid to texting and then to talking on the phone. We did phone chats for about a month, through which I learned he was a medical student and he owned his own computer repair shop and had his own apartment. At the end of that month, he finally convinced me to meet him in real life. For our first date, we arranged to meet for lunch in the food court of a mall and then go see a movie. I didn't tell my friends or family where I was going though, because I was embarrassed to admit I was going on an OkCupid date, so I tried to make our date setting as public as possible for safety. Surprisingly, it ended up being one of the best dates of my life. We got so involved in our conversation that we actually missed the movie and ended up just walking around inside the mall till it got dark. Then he wanted to head out to the parking lot to sit in his car and continue the discussion, but it was getting late and I really had to go home, so I passed. After I got home, I couldn't wait for our next date. I wanted a boyfriend so badly, and I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this way about a guy, so I eagerly agreed to his plans for our next date. We made plans to meet at his apartment for dinner. I naively thought that since I had already met him once, I didn't need to worry about telling anyone that I would be out with him that night. But after what came next, I will never make that mistake again. So there I was, on my way to his place on the evening of our date, when he texted me that he was working late at his computer repair shop and asked if I could come meet him there instead. The address he texted me for his shop was about 2 hours away from the address he had given me for his apartment, but I was already on the road and I was desperate to make this work, so I didn't mind. The first real red flag went off when I arrived. His shop was a tiny one-room building not far off from a shack. It was on a woodsy residential street outside of town and had no sign outside. I texted him to get confirmation that this was the right place, and he confirmed, so I walked in. Inside the shack, it was even worse. Computer parts were scattered all over the floor, nothing looked professional, and the carpet reeked of smoke and weed. He also didn't look like he was working at all. He was sitting with a group of older men who looked to be in their 40s, passing around a pipe. He introduced them as his friends, and we hung out with them for about 20 minutes, during which none of them spoke to me or acknowledged me. After they passed the pipe around a couple more times, Mike offered to drive me to his apartment. I tried to tell him I could drive myself, but he insisted he drive because he only had one parking spot. Reluctantly, I agreed, reminding myself that our first date went great, so I could trust him. When we got there, at first I couldn't even tell it was an apartment. We had arrived in a parking lot of a small hair salon called Salon True, which was closed for the night, and by the way, had plenty of empty parking spaces. He showed me to a door beneath the salon, which led to the basement of the building. Inside was a medium-sized cement room with nothing but an industrial sink, a pair of dumbbells, a foam mat, and no windows. The only decoration he had was a bobblehead of a character from a show I told him I had liked that looked brand new. I would have considered the idea that maybe he was struggling financially and had lied about everything because he was embarrassed about his financial situation, but then I saw the giant flat-screen TV and camera up against the wall. I was starting to get really freaked out. He closed the door behind us, and I watched helplessly as he closed the abnormal number of locks on it. He must have seen the fear on my face because he quickly assured me that the reason he had so many locks was because the hairdressers upstairs hated him for no reason and had tried to enter his apartment on multiple occasions. At this point, every possible alarm was going off in my head. I was locked in a basement with no car, and no one knew where I was. I didn't even know where I was. But I had one trick up my sleeve. He walked across the room, his back towards me, and bent down to pick up one of the weighted dumbbells. While his back was turned, I pulled out my iPhone slightly out of my pocket and booted up a game that had a song that sounded like a ringtone, then shoved it back in my pocket. When he turned back to look at me, the phone in my pocket appeared to be ringing. I answered the phone, pretending it was my dad, and faked that phone conversation like my life depended on it. I tried my hardest to sell that my dad was mad at me for being out so late and demanded to know where I was. I spoke the name of the salon and the name of the town we were in. I made it seem like my dad knew exactly where Salon True was and that he told me to come home immediately or he would come get me. Thankfully, it worked. When I fake hung up, Mike was already unlocking the door. We got in his car and he drove back to the computer shop much faster than before. He dropped me off at my car, apologized, and said he would text me about our next date. I had never been more happy to be back in my own car. A few days later, he hadn't contacted me yet, so I tried calling him for an explanation. Apparently, his service had been disconnected. Later that day, I told the story to my good friend Eric and tried to bring up Mike's OkCupid profile page, but that had been deleted too. However, I was lame, and when we were calling each other regularly, I had his OkCupid profile saved on my phone as his contact picture. So I showed that to Eric, and he actually recognized Mike immediately. My friend Eric was a student employee at the IT department in his university who helped other students with computer issues. Eric said Mike would come in frequently to get viruses taken off his laptop, viruses that looked like they were coming from really sketchy adult websites. And to top it all off, his name apparently wasn't Mike. Eric was able to use info he had gathered about this guy from the IT department ticketing system to look him up on the school's database. Turns out, this guy was not a med student at all. He was older than he said he was and had dropped out of school that semester. I never saw him again, but I'm thankful I didn't spend another minute with that liar. Who knows what he had planned for me? I met a guy online. We talked for a day or two, but I was at the tail end of my degree and things were getting to be a lot, so I decided no dating until I was done. I let the few guys that seemed nice know before deleting the dating app so they would know why I deleted it and wouldn't think I was ghosting them. The last guy I met happened to be online when I sent it and said I seemed cool and asked if we could keep in touch. So I said sure, no worries, and added him on Facebook. Knowing what I know now, I should have been more firm. After that, maybe once a week, he reached out saying, "Hey, how are you? What are you up to?" Mostly normal conversational stuff like that. I only really chatted to him about school, work, or the gym. But after maybe 2 to 3 months of that, he messaged me saying, "Hey, we've been chatting for a bit, let's grab coffee." Honestly, he seemed nice enough, so I said sure. Just to be sure, I reiterated that it would be his friends though, and he said that was fine with him. I was heading into finals though, so we made plans to meet in 3 weeks' time after I finished my exams. After we made those plans, he started messaging me more and more regularly, more than once a day, and then he started calling it a date. I wanted to make sure we were still on the same page, so I just said, "Hey, you keep calling it a date, just making sure we're clear that it's just a catch-up as friends." That's when he completely snapped. He sent me all sorts of horrible things on Facebook, so I quickly blocked him. I gave him my number though when we made plans, so he quickly started calling and leaving me voicemails. When he started doing this, it was late at night, so I just put my phone on silent and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to 37 missed calls and voicemails between 10 p.m., not stopping until 4 a.m., as well as a multitude of horrible text messages. Unfortunately, this happened almost 20 years ago when you couldn't just block someone easily on a phone. At first I was hopeful that if I just ignored him, he would get bored, but after about a week, he still wasn't slowing down, with dozens of calls a day. I was done with him at this point, so I called my phone company to have him blocked, but they said you can only block 3 people, making sure I really wanted to do it. I had to jump through all these hoops, and then, at the end, for some reason, they turned around and said they couldn't do it, that I would have to call the police instead. So I called the police, and they too gave me the runaround and said I would have to call the phone company to get him blocked. But I was able to make a statement of harassment in case he did something more. 3 weeks later, he was still going strong, and his text messages got darker. He started saying he was going to force me to go on a date with him and that I wouldn't have a choice. Then he started saying that if I wouldn't come to him, he would come to me. What really freaked me out though was when he started telling me my schedule with where I would be at any given time, which he had clearly put together based on our weekly conversations about normal stuff. Each day, multiple times a day, he started threatening to come to where I was. Fearing for my safety, I had to stop doing most of my regular activities and pretty much became a hermit. Eventually, everything culminated with this man making a threat to my life. I can't remember what he said word for word, but it was essentially, "Girls like you get what they deserve," or something along those lines. It carried with it a clear implicit threat that he would be the one to make it happen. I contacted the police again, and that was enough for a restraining order. Thankfully, I never heard from him again. I met a guy on Tinder, and we really started to hit it off. We'd been chatting for a few weeks and even discovered we had a few mutual friends. So one night, I was pretty intoxicated and was feeling brave, so I decided to call an Uber to his place. When I got there, we talked outside for a while and ended up vibing even better in person. I even opened up to him about my health problems, and he opened up to me about a sister who had apparently passed away from a similar condition to mine. I was curious about his sister, but I definitely did not want to pry. Things were going well, so we walked into his house, and it smelled like 1,000 dead rats were rotting under the floorboard. I started to look around and realized the whole house looked like a cluttered storage unit. Then he took me to his room, which gave off a feminine vibe, but otherwise was seemingly normal. And then we hooked up. I ended up falling asleep there and woke up around 10 a.m. to the stench of death. I opened my eyes, feeling very sober, and started to look around the room. I noticed that only women's clothing were hung in his closet. I felt dread sink in as I started to assume that I had possibly been used to cheat on someone. When he woke up, I asked him what he did for work, something I definitely should have known by this point, and he dodged the question. Already trying to disengage myself from the situation, I sat up and looked at the pillow I'd been sleeping on. It had no pillowcase and was covered in what looked to be old blood. It looked like the blood had been coughed onto it. I started putting the unpleasant pieces together. I asked as sensitively as I could, "Hey, was this your sister's room? I noticed the clothes in the closet." And he responded, "Yeah, and this is her bed. I haven't changed or washed anything. It just makes me feel better to be in her bed. This is actually where I held her when she died, and you remind me so much of her. I really, really like you." And then he casually tried to hook up with me, like he didn't just drop the most unsettling news. I can't lie, I felt immensely sorry for him, but I needed to get out of there, so I made up some excuse and left. I decided not to entirely ghost him because of how bad I felt for him. He was clearly dealing with some really dark stuff, so we actually kept in contact for a few weeks, until I went on my Find My Friends app and noticed he had clearly taken my phone while I was asleep that night and shared my location with himself. Disgusted, I called him and completely went off on him. This was not my first rodeo with a stalker type, and I was not dealing with it. He told me some nonsense about how he couldn't believe I thought he would do that, and that I was being a really terrible person dumping him because his cat had recently died. But I was fully done at that point, so I just blocked him. After he said that about his cat, it really makes me wonder what that smell actually was.